I wanted to share with you an interesting conversation between Glenn Greenwald and Katie Halper and Matt Taibbi about the recent U.S. election. And he goes through a few points, and I wanted to pick out a couple of excerpts from this, which I think you might find interesting. In particular, something that Glenn was talking about, Brazil, and how they conduct incredible elections there. They have almost the population of the United States, and yet they still manage to have the election results almost on the day, without any sort of trouble. And he sort of mentions how really in many ways the US just must want it this way, must want it to be the schmozzle full of shenanigans, because this has been going on for so long now, and they have done nothing. Even when one of, I think it was Tulsi Gabbard, tried to bring in a bill that would make sure there were paper ballots and a way of tracking things, they sort of rejected that. Nobody supported it. And then there's also the fact that the Democratic Party, for example, will always make sure there are these defecters, and they circulate these defecters so that when they come to pass a bill, there'll always be these Democratic Party defectors who will end up stuffing up the bill, and the Democrats then pretend as if they really wanted the public to have this particular social support, but unfortunately, in quotes, the somebody defected, and you can never actually pin it on any one particular politician, because they keep circulating these politicians. So that is also another political tactic, and not one that's only exercised by the US Democratic Party. We have this sort of thing happening here in Australia. People pretending also to put up bills that they know will never pass, which is something that all politicians, including Tulsi Gabbard, who won't be in politics much longer, but they'll put up these bills and it makes them look progressive, but they know it'll never pass. And that's the Democratic Party does that over and over again in the US, pretending that they're progressive, when really they're as right-wing as the GOP. And you can tell that very, very clearly now with the cabinet that Joe Biden has pulled together. And it's full of Silicon Valley people. It's full of literally Republicans and people who are incredibly conservative. And so basically the GOP didn't even have to get in, sort of win this election. They have basically a Republican in office and a very, very conservative and very problematic cabinet. And they'll also have a very problematic Secretary of State. I think that's either going to be Susan Rice or someone like that. And these people, often have never met a war they didn't like. They're real warmongers. So I would invite you to check out Jimmy Dore's recent live stream, although that's not available now for the public, but he'll be putting up excerpts from that live stream. And I invite you to check it out because he talks about Joe Biden's cabinet. So that's the Jimmy Dore show. That was a very interesting conversation today. So anyway, Glenn Greenwald, who was formerly from The Intercept, he's left The Intercept recently because they were suppressing information and censoring. And he did not like that, so he left The Intercept. I did a video on that. I also want to mention that Glenn Greenwald never ever really criticized Pierre Aldiamar. I always get his name wrong. The billionaire who backed The Intercept, who's actually done some dreadful things. Glenn Greenwald has never really ripped that guy apart and sort of critiqued him, which is an interesting thing, but I digress. So anyway, this is an interesting little chat. I've just picked out some excerpts which I thought were sort of interesting, that you might find interesting. So thanks so much for watching. Check them out. Stay tuned.
And the thing, maybe one of the reasons why it strikes me is because the country in which I live and have lived for 15 years, Brazil, is not exactly renowned for being a country of technological efficiency or systemic organization. It's pretty much the opposite. Nothing works well in Brazil. That's one of its great charms. And it's also a country that's obviously much poorer than the United States is. And yet, despite a fairly similar population size, it has like about 220 million people or so, but it ends up having a similar number of ballots because voting is mandatory. It takes place, the election does, on a Sunday, so there's no conflict with any voting, with any jobs rather. The voting age is 16. So I think in the 2018 presidential election, Brazil counted about 105 million ballots, which was maybe just 20 million fewer than the US counted in its 2016 presidential race. And yet the way it works is everybody goes to the polls all day. The polls close at 6. at 6 o'clock, 90% of the vote total nationwide is released, not just for president, but for governor, for Congress, for the various senators who are running as well. And you know the entire vote total, and then maybe 2 hours later, 2.5 hours later at most, 100% of the vote totals are released, and they're completely reliable. No one has any doubts about them because they're federalized and it's all done through automation. How is it possible that Brazil and countless countries in Europe can count their votes instantaneously in a way that gives and yet here in the US, California, and so many other states, even without the pandemic, take weeks, if not months, to count all the votes? It's mind-boggling. Why do they need to create and sell a new app to the Democratic Party to count votes? Counting votes is a very fucking simple task, right? You don't need a new app to do it. And especially one that's never been tested. So I think that, the people who benefit are people who want that wiggle room inside the voting process. That's the only thing that makes sense. I know that sounds conspiratorial, but this is how, particularly, the party nominating process has always been done. When Democrats were talking about the possibility of Bernie Sanders winning a plurality of votes, but not a majority, and trying to steal the election from him on the convention floor, I went back and read a ton of real-time reports about what happened in 1968 with Eugene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey and that entire process. And back then, most of the states were determined by caucus precisely to deprive voters of the ability to determine the party's nominee and to make sure that it was the party bosses that decided. And of course, the kind of iconic smoke-filled rooms was how party nominees were often chosen. And that ethos of stealing it from the voters and letting the party bosses or whoever else kind of tinker with the mechanics of the voting process is very endemic to U.S. political history. It's not like it's a new conspiracy that we have to concoct to explain why this is happening. One of the funny things about Russiagate and the whole fixation on Russiagate is that it was all supposed to be about protecting the sanctity of our elections and fortifying voting systems to make sure that there could be no hacking. And I remember I interviewed Tulsi Gabbard in 2019 after the Mueller report came out. And she said, I've had a bill pending that I've been pushing even further in light of this Russiagate, fixation that she never bought into, but wanted to use it to win support for this bill she had pending that was very simple to federalize the voting system, to automate it, but also have paper ballots to back it up to make sure there was no questions about the integrity of the voting. She couldn't get any co-sponsors in the Democratic Party all the time that they were out there talking about protecting our voting infrastructure and all that. It was just a ploy, an instrument, a weapon to bash Trump and the Republicans over the head with. They didn't have the slightest genuine interest in it, as evidenced by the fact that there was so little interest in her bill. If you cared about the integrity of the voting process, if you actually wanted to remove the ability for domestic shenanigans or foreign interference, the solution is very simple, right? I made a joke on Twitter the other day in Portuguese saying Brazilians should send observers and teachers to the United States to teach them how to hold a free and fair election. If Brazil figured it out, if countries in Eastern and Western Europe can count their votes on the same day the voting takes place, obviously the US could do it if there was a will to do it. But there isn't, and I don't know the answer, right? You can speculate about the motives, but clearly what we know for sure is they like it this way. I wrote this article once. It was, I think, in 2000, before Obama. Maybe it was after Obama, because I would, when from 2005 to 2008, before I got into I completely hate the Democrat stage. I used to be one of those progressive bloggers who always thought, oh, they just need more spine.
Exactly.
They really want to do good things, but they're just afraid. That whole Daily Kos mythology for children. And I remember what they used to do is, there'd be some bill, and I would get really excited. It would be to ban or to guarantee habeas corpus for war on terror suspects, so they get at least one crack at a court before they're thrown into prison for 3 decades. And this is something the Democrats were campaigning on and were denouncing. And every single time there'd be a bill like that, it would always fail by 2 or 3 votes because of Democratic defections. But they would always make sure that the defections rotated. So you could never focus on any one who is terrible. They kept just rotating it. So it was like that kind of game when you're playing with a kid with, you have that hammer and the things pop up and you have to smash them, but you can never actually win because they just keep popping up.
Whack-a-mole.
And I call it villain rotation. That's, it's whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
They're experts at that. The Democrats are expert at denying their voters what they pretend they want to give them.
Right.
And then pretending that they're really upset by it. So Mitch McConnell is the perfect excuse for the Biden administration to just be as centrist-y and pro-Wall Street and pro-Silicon Valley as possible, which of course is what they'd want to do anyway.
Oh, yeah.